They laughed when Grace Holloway inherited an old cabin hidden deep in the Colorado mountains. To her family, it was nothing more than a collapsing shack covered in snow. But 3 days later, the orphan girl they pitied uncovered a hidden underground chamber containing a $3 million secret no one saw coming. What she discovered beneath that cabin didn't just change her life forever. It revealed why her grandfather trusted her more than anyone else in the family. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the people who are underestimated the most often carry the greatest value inside them. So, stay with me until the end, because this hidden inheritance story has a powerful lesson you'll never forget. The cold mountain wind swept through the tall pine trees surrounding Blackwater Ridge, carrying the scent of snow and damp earth through the empty valley below. Hidden deep in the forests of northern Colorado, the old mining town had long been forgotten by the rest of the world. Most people who grew up there spent their lives trying to leave, but not Grace Holloway. At 21 years old, Grace had nowhere else to go. She stepped off the rusted Greyhound bus with a single duffel bag hanging from her shoulder, her worn boots sinking into the slush gathered along the roadside. Her oversized brown coat had once belonged to her grandfather, Walter Holloway. The sleeves were too long for her thin arms, but she wore it anyway. It still smelled faintly of cedar wood and fireplace smoke. People stared as she walked through town. Some recognized her immediately. The orphan girl Walter had raised alone after her parents died in a highway accident more than a decade ago. Others only whispered quietly behind diner windows and gas station counters. That's Walter Holloway's granddaughter. Poor thing has nothing left now. I heard all she inherited was that broken-down cabin near the ridge. Grace kept walking without lifting her eyes. Today was her grandfather's funeral, and somewhere beyond the frozen woods, waiting beneath years of silence and dust, stood the old cabin everyone laughed about, except Walter Holloway, because unlike the others, he had never called it worthless. The reading of Walter Holloway's will took place the same afternoon as the funeral. By then, the snow had started falling harder over Blackwater Ridge, covering the narrow streets and rusted rooftops in a cold layer of white. The town looked quieter now, almost frozen in time the same way it had looked for most of Grace Holloway's life. The lawyer's office sat near the end of Main Street, squeezed between an abandoned hardware store and a shuttered diner with faded red booths still visible through dusty windows. The wooden sign above the door creaked softly in the wind. Inside, the air smelled like old paper, coffee, and damp wool coats. Grace sat alone at the far end of the long oak table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken much since the funeral. Truthfully, there hadn't been anyone to speak to. Around the room, relatives filled the chairs one by one. Uncle Raymond Holloway sat closest to the lawyer, his expensive watch gleaming beneath the yellow ceiling light. Beside him was his wife, Gloria, wearing pearl earrings and the same fake, sympathetic smile she'd worn at every family gathering Grace could remember. Across from them sat Cousin Derek, scrolling through his phone with barely concealed boredom. A few others whispered quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing toward Grace before quickly looking away. No one greeted her warmly. No one ever really had. To them, Grace had always been Walter's burden. The quiet orphan girl he'd taken in after tragedy ruined her life. The poor child in second-hand clothes. The girl who worked double shifts at the roadside diner while everyone else left town for college, careers, and bigger lives. And now Walter was gone. The only person who had ever truly stayed. Mr. Keller, the family attorney, adjusted his glasses and opened a thick folder in front of him. "Thank you all for coming," he said carefully. "As requested by Mr. Walter Holloway, his final will and testament will now be read in full. The room quieted instantly. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Walter's belongings were distributed first. His old pickup truck went to Raymond. A collection of hunting rifles was divided among two nephews. The small savings account, far smaller than everyone had hoped, was split between various family members. Each item was met with nods, murmurs, or quiet disappointment. Grace remained silent. She didn't care about any of it. Not the money, not the truck, not even the family photographs they divided like trading cards across the table. All she could think about was Walter's empty chair by the fireplace. Then Mr. Keller paused. He turned a page slowly. "And lastly," he said, clearing his throat, "to my granddaughter, Grace Holloway, I leave full ownership of my property located beyond Blackwater Ridge, including the cabin and surrounding land." For one brief moment, the room went completely silent. Then came the laughter. Not loud at first, just a short chuckle from Derek. Then Gloria covered her mouth, trying unsuccessfully to hide a smirk. Raymond leaned back in his chair and laughed openly. "The cabin," he said, "you're kidding." Another relative shook his head. "That rotten place is still standing. I thought the roof would have collapsed years ago." "Well," Gloria added sweetly, "at least Grace will have somewhere to stay now." The room filled with quiet amusement. Grace lowered her eyes toward the table, her cheeks burning slightly. Not from embarrassment, from grief, because none of them understood. That cabin wasn't just an old building hidden in the woods. It was Walter. It was the smell of cedar wood smoke drifting through winter nights. It was warm soup simmering on the stove after snowstorms. It was old blankets, quiet conversations, and the sound of Walter teaching her how to survive when the world stopped caring. The others saw broken wood and isolation. Grace saw home. "Mr. Keller waited for the laughter to die before continuing. "In addition," he said carefully, "Mr. Holloway requested that this envelope be given to Grace personally after the reading." He slid a worn envelope across the table. Grace stared at it. Her name was written across the front in Walter's familiar handwriting, rough, uneven, but steady. The sight of it tightened something painfully inside her chest. She picked it up gently, almost afraid the paper might disappear in her hands. Raymond scoffed. "What is a treasure map to the shack?" A few people laughed again. Grace ignored them, because suddenly she remembered something. A night from years ago. She had been 12, sitting beside Walter during a thunderstorm while rain hammered against the cabin roof. The power had gone out, leaving only firelight dancing across the walls. Walter had looked at her quietly before saying, "People laugh at things they don't understand." Grace. She remembered looking up at him. What if they never understand? Walter smiled softly into the fire. Then let them laugh. The memory hit her now with painful clarity. Grace tightened her fingers around the envelope. Maybe Walter had known this moment was coming. Maybe he had known exactly how the family would react. One by one, the relatives began standing, already discussing what they planned to do with their inheritances. Raymond talked about selling the truck. Derek joked about turning Walter's hunting rifles into wall decorations for rich tourists. Nobody mentioned the cabin again. Not seriously. To them, it was worthless. An old burden hidden deep in the woods. But as Grace sat there holding the envelope, she felt something strange settle quietly inside her chest. Not anger, not sadness, something steadier, something waiting. Outside, the snow continued falling over Blackwater Ridge, burying the roads leading toward the old cabin near the ridge. The place everyone mocked. The place Walter Holloway had protected for decades. the place he had chosen to leave only to her, and for the first time since the funeral began. Grace slowly lifted her eyes. Then, almost invisibly, she smiled. The road leading to Walter Holloway's cabin had nearly disappeared beneath the snow. Grace drove slowly through the forest, her old pickup rattling against the frozen gravel path as tall pine trees closed in around her from both sides. The deeper she went into the woods, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no voices, no town, only wind. The cabin finally appeared through the trees just before sunset. It stood alone at the edge of a narrow ridge overlooking the valley below, weathered, crooked, and half buried beneath fresh snow. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the old lantern beside the door swayed gently in the wind. Still, Grace felt her chest tighten the moment she saw it. Home. She stepped out of the truck, her boots sinking into the snow as icy air rushed against her face. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at the cabin while memories flooded back all at once. Walter teaching her how to split firewood, the sound of rain tapping against the roof during storms, the smell of coffee brewing before sunrise. For years, this place had been the only corner of the world where Grace had ever felt safe. Now it felt empty, lonely, like it was waiting for someone who would never return. She climbed in the porch steps slowly and unlocked the front door. The hinges groaned softly as it opened. Inside, the cabin smelled exactly the same. Cedarwood, dust, old books, fireplace smoke buried deep into the walls after decades of winters. Nothing had changed. Walter's coat still hung beside the door. His reading glasses rested near the armchair. A half-finished crossword puzzle remained on the small table near the fireplace, exactly where he had left it. Grace swallowed hard. The silence hurt more than she expected. She set her bag down carefully before walking deeper into the cabin, running her fingers along familiar wooden walls. Every object carried pieces of Walter inside it, and suddenly the loneliness became unbearable. Grace sank slowly into the old armchair near the fireplace and finally allowed herself to cry. Not quietly, not politely, but fully. All the grief she had held inside since the funeral broke loose at once, because Walter had been more than a grandfather. He had been her parent, her protector, her entire world. Outside, snow continued falling heavily against the windows, while darkness slowly consumed the forest. Hours passed before Grace finally stood again. The cabin had grown bitterly cold by then. She wiped her face, grabbed the firewood from beside the hearth, and began rebuilding the fire exactly the way Walter had taught her years ago. Small wood first, then larger pieces, patience before flame. Soon the fire crackled softly, casting warm amber light across the room. That was when Grace remembered the envelope. She pulled it carefully from her coat pocket and opened it near the firelight. Inside was a single folded letter. Walter's handwriting covered the page. Grace, if you are reading this, then I'm already gone. And if the family laughed when you inherited the cabin, good, let them. People only see what's on the surface. They always have. But there are things beneath this cabin worth more than money, and I trust only you to protect them. When the time feels right, look beneath the old stove. You'll understand everything. Walter. Grace stared at the letter for several seconds. Beneath the old stove, slowly. She looked toward the cast-iron wood stove sitting near the kitchen wall. Her pulse quickened. At first, she told herself it probably meant nothing. Maybe old documents. Maybe keepsakes Walter had hidden away from greedy relatives. But something about the letter felt different. Intentional, like Walter had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Grace grabbed the flashlight from her bag and walked carefully toward the stove. The wooden floor creaked beneath her boots. Kneeling beside it, she brushed away years of dust and ash near the base. That's when she noticed it. Scratches. Thin marks carved into the floorboards beneath the stove legs. As if it had been moved before, her heartbeat began pounding harder now. With both hands, Grace pushed carefully against the heavy stove. At first, nothing happened. Then slowly, painfully, the stove shifted several inches across the wooden floor. A freezing draft of air rushed upward instantly. Grace froze. Beneath the stove was a rusted iron ring attached to a square wooden hatch hidden perfectly within the floorboards. Oh my God! Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The hatch resisted at first, stuck from years untouched. But after one hard pull, it suddenly broke loose with a loud crack. A wave of cold air escaped from the darkness below. Grace aimed the flashlight downward. Wooden stairs disappeared deep beneath the cabin. For several seconds, she couldn't move. The silence below felt ancient. Waiting, then slowly, gripping the flashlight tightly, Grace descended the narrow staircase, step by step. The underground chamber was larger than she expected. Stone walls surrounded the room. Dust floated through the cold air. Wooden shelves lined both sides of the cellar, stacked with old crates, locked metal boxes, faded journals, and carefully wrapped bundles hidden beneath heavy cloth. Grace's breathing became shallow. This wasn't random storage. This was organized, protected, preserved. She stepped closer to the nearest crate and carefully pulled back the cloth covering it. Then she gasped. Coins. Hundreds of them. Silver coins, gold coins. Rows upon rows of perfectly preserved currency, sealed inside protective cases. Some looked ancient. Others carried military engravings and foreign markings she didn't recognize. Nearby sat stacks of war bonds tied carefully with faded ribbon. Locked boxes filled with medals, old pocket watches, documents, letters. And resting at the center of the room was a large leather journal. Grace opened it carefully. Inside were pages upon pages of handwritten entries documenting every item in the cellar, dates, origins, estimated values, and stories connected to each piece. Walter had cataloged everything for decades. Grace's hands trembled as she turned another page, then another, and suddenly, one realization crashed into her all at once. The cabin wasn't worthless, not even close. Walter Holloway had been hiding something beneath this place for years. Something enormous. And upstairs, back in town, the family was still laughing. Grace didn't leave the underground chamber for hours. At some point, night had fully swallowed the forest outside, but down beneath the cabin, time felt strangely suspended as if the world above no longer existed. The flashlight rested beside her on one of the wooden crates while silence settled gently around the cellar walls. Not an empty silence. A living one. The kind filled with memory. Grace sat carefully at the small table near the center of the room. Walter's leather journal open in front of her. Her fingers moved slowly across the yellowed pages while the fire crackled faintly upstairs through the floorboards overhead. Every entry told a story. Not just of money, not even of treasure, but of people. A silver coin carried home by a soldier after World War II. A cracked pocket watch traded between miners during the winter of 1931. Letters written by families who never saw each other again after war scattered them across oceans. Walter hadn't collected valuables. He had collected lives. Grace's chest tightened painfully as she continued reading, because suddenly She understood something that the rest of the family never would. Walter had never hidden this collection out of greed. He had protected it. Protected the stories. Protected the memories. Protected the people buried inside every object resting in this room. And somehow, he had trusted her to continue that responsibility. The realization terrified her. Grace leaned back slowly in the chair, staring around the underground chamber while emotions tangled heavily inside her chest. Why me? The question echoed quietly through her mind. Why would Walter leave something this important to someone like her? She thought about Raymond with his expensive truck, Derek with his business connections, the others with their polished lives and college degrees. Compared to them, Grace had nothing. No money, no education, no future beyond waitressing shifts and overdue bills. Most days, she still felt like the frightened orphan girl people pitied behind her back. And yet Walter had chosen her, not them. Her eyes drifted back toward the journal. Tucked carefully between 2 pages was an old photograph. Grace picked it up gently. It showed Walter as a younger man, standing beside another man in military uniform sometime decades earlier. Both were smiling beside stacks of crates nearly identical to the ones now surrounding her underground. On the back, written in faded ink, were only 4 words. Some things must survive. Grace swallowed hard. For the first time in her life, she began seeing herself differently. Not as someone abandoned by the world, but as someone trusted by it. Upstairs, the wind howled softly against the cabin walls while snow continued piling against the porch outside. Yet beneath the cabin, Grace felt warmer than she had in years. Because for the first time, she no longer felt invisible. Walter had seen her, truly seen her. Not as weak, not as helpless, not as a burden, but as someone quiet enough to listen, careful enough to protect something fragile, strong enough to carry history without destroying it. Tears filled Grace's eyes again, though this time they came differently. Not from grief, from understanding. All her life, people had mistaken silence for weakness. Walter never had. Hours later, Grace climbed slowly back upstairs carrying the journal against her chest. The cabin greeted her with warmth from the fire still burning softly in the stove. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, looking around differently now. The old walls no longer seemed broken. The cabin no longer looked abandoned. Every scratch in the wood, every loose floorboard, every faded photograph hanging crooked on the walls. All of it suddenly mattered. This place wasn't falling apart. It was holding together, holding decades of secrets, of sacrifice, of memory. And somehow, now it belonged to her. Grace walked toward the kitchen window and looked out into the darkness beyond the trees. Far below the ridge, tiny lights from Blackwater Ridge flickered faintly through the snowfall. Somewhere down there, her relatives were probably celebrating their inheritances, laughing, spending money already, still believing Walter had left Grace with nothing but an old cabin. A small smile touched her face. They had no idea. But strangely, she no longer cared whether they ever found out, because the value of this place could never truly be measured in dollars. It was something heavier than money, something sacred. Grace moved quietly through the cabin before finally stopping beside Walter's old armchair near the fire. Folded carefully across the back rested his thick wool blanket. She picked it up slowly and wrapped it around herself. The scent of cedar wood still lingered faintly within the fabric. And suddenly, for the first time since Walter died, Grace didn't feel alone. The firelight danced softly across the room while snow continued falling outside. She looked down at the journal in her lap, then toward the hidden hatch beneath the stove. There was still so much she didn't understand, So many stories left unopened, so many secrets waiting below. But one truth had already become painfully clear. Walter Holloway hadn't left her an inheritance. He had left her a purpose, and somewhere deep inside herself, Grace realized something else too. The quiet orphan girl everyone once pitied was gone. In her place sat someone new, someone watching over the past, someone chosen to protect what others failed to value. A keeper, and beneath the old cabin, hidden under decades of silence and dust, an entire legacy waited for her to continue it. The snowstorm lasted 3 days. By the time the skies finally cleared above Blackwater Ridge, the cabin had disappeared beneath thick layers of white, isolated from the rest of the world like a forgotten memory buried deep in the mountains. Grace barely noticed. She spent nearly every waking hour inside the underground chamber beneath the cabin, moving carefully between shelves and crates with Walter's journal constantly open beside her. The deeper she looked, the more unbelievable the collection became. There were rare gold coins dating back over a century, military medals wrapped in cloth alongside handwritten letters from soldiers long dead, foreign currency sealed inside glass cases, war bonds, documents, antique jewelry, historical artifacts connected to families whose names no longer existed anywhere else. And every single item had been cataloged in Walter's careful handwriting. Protected, preserved, remembered. Grace sat cross-legged on the cellar floor one evening, flipping through another section of the journal when something slipped loose from between the pages. A folded document, newer than the others. She unfolded it carefully. At the top were typed words. Private Collection Appraisal. Holloway Archive. Grace frowned slightly as her eyes moved lower down the page. Then her breathing stopped. 1914. St. Gaudens. Double Eagle. Coin. Estimated value $180,000. Civil War Officer Medal Collection. Estimated value $430,000. European Gold Currency Set. Estimated value $610,000. Unredeemed Government War Bonds. Estimated value $920,000. Additional undocumented historical assets. Value pending. At the bottom of the page, one final line had been circled in black ink. Estimated total collection. Value $3,247,000. Grace stared at the number in silence. Her mind couldn't fully process it. $3 million. Hidden beneath a cabin everyone mocked. A shaky breath escaped her lips as she slowly lowered the paper into her lap. All those years. Walter had been living quietly in this old cabin while sitting above a fortune, yet nothing about him had ever reflected wealth. His clothes had been worn. The roof leaked every winter. The truck barely started half the time. He could have sold everything. Could have left Blackwater Ridge decades ago. But he hadn't, because this had never been about money. Grace looked around the cellar again, and suddenly the room felt different. Not richer, heavier, sacred somehow. Walter hadn't spent his life protecting treasure. He had protected history. And now that responsibility belonged to her. The realization sent a strange mixture of fear and awe rushing through her chest. For a long moment, Grace simply sat there, listening to the silence beneath the cabin. Then another thought crept quietly into her mind. If this appraisal existed, someone else knew about the collection. The thought unsettled her immediately. She climbed upstairs quickly and searched through Walter's desk drawers until she found an old business card tucked beneath a stack of receipts. Harlan Pierce, Historical Appraisals and Rare Collections, Denver, Colorado. A phone number was scribbled beneath the name. Grace hesitated before dialing. The line rang twice. Then a calm, older voice answered. Harlan Pierce speaking. Grace swallowed nervously. "My name is Grace Holloway," she said quietly. I think you once worked with Walter Holloway." There was a pause. Then the man spoke again, slower this time. "Walter's granddaughter." "Yes." Another silence. And then, "Well," Harlan said softly, "I wondered when I might finally hear from you." Grace tightened her grip on the phone. "You knew about the collection." "Knew about it?" Harlan chuckled faintly. "Miss Holloway, your grandfather owned one of the most remarkable private historical archives I've ever seen." Grace closed her eyes briefly. "It's really worth that much." "Oh," Harlan replied carefully. "Far more by now, most likely." The words hit her like cold water. Far more. Grace leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to steady herself. Why didn't he ever sell any of it? Harlan was quiet for several seconds before answering. "Because Walter believed history shouldn't belong to greedy people," he said finally. "He once told me that money disappears, but stories survive only if someone chooses to protect them." Grace looked toward the hidden hatch beneath the stove. Suddenly, Walter's final letter made perfect sense. "There are things beneath this cabin worth more than money." Tears stung her eyes again. Because even now, after his death, Walter was still teaching her something. Harlan cleared his throat gently. "Your grandfather also told me something else years ago." Grace listened carefully. "He said one day the collection would belong to someone kind enough not to destroy it." The room fell silent. Grace couldn't speak, because for the first time in her life, someone was speaking about her as though she mattered. Not as the poor orphan girl from Blackwater Ridge. Not as someone broken, but as someone trusted. Someone chosen. Outside, wind swept softly across the mountains while sunlight reflected across endless snow beyond the cabin windows. Grace slowly walked toward the fireplace and stared at Walter's empty chair again. The grief was still there. It probably always would be. But beneath it now lived something else, too. Purpose. That night, Grace returned to the underground chamber carrying fresh notebooks, labels, and storage boxes from town. If Walter had spent his life protecting this legacy, then she would continue what he started. Carefully, she began organizing the shelves exactly the way he once had. Cataloging items, cleaning dust from glass cases, reading old letters aloud quietly to herself beneath the warm cellar lights. Hours passed without her noticing. For the first time in years, Grace no longer felt lost. She had something now that no one in Blackwater Ridge could understand. Not wealth, not luck, meaning, and somewhere above her, hidden beneath snow and silence, the old cabin creaked softly in the mountain wind, no longer abandoned, but alive. The changes began quietly. At first, Grace barely noticed them herself. She still woke before sunrise, still carried firewood inside with frozen hands, still wore Walter Holloway's oversized coat while snow drifted endlessly across the mountains surrounding the cabin. But something inside her had shifted. The frightened orphan girl who once apologized for taking up space was slowly disappearing. And in her place, someone stronger was beginning to emerge. Weeks passed. Every morning, Grace descended into the underground chamber beneath the cabin with a notebook tucked beneath her arm and Walter's journal close behind. She worked carefully for hours at a time beneath the warm cellar lights, organizing the collection piece by piece. She created detailed records, photographed every artifact, researched military markings late into the night using Walter's old laptop and books stacked around the cabin. The deeper she went, the more she realized the collection was far larger than anyone had imagined. Some items dated back over 200 years. Others connected directly to wars, migrations, and forgotten families whose stories would have vanished forever without Walter preserving them. Grace handled each piece gently, almost reverently, because now she understood something important. These weren't objects. They were echoes of human lives. And for the first time in years, Grace felt useful. Not pitied, not tolerated. Needed. One afternoon, while cataloging a box of old military medals, she found a folded newspaper clipping hidden beneath the velvet cloth. The headline read, "Local Miner Saves Historical Records from Fire, 1978. Below the article was a photograph of a younger Walter Holloway carrying smoke-damaged crates from a burning building in Denver. Grace stared at the picture silently. Even back then, he had been protecting history. Not for recognition, not for money. Simply because someone had to. A lump formed painfully in her throat. The more she learned about Walter, the more she realized he had spent most of his life being misunderstood, too. People saw an old man hiding away in the mountains, but they never saw the guardian beneath it. And suddenly, Grace understood why he had chosen her, because she knew what it felt like to be overlooked. The realization changed everything. She stopped seeing herself as the poor orphan girl from Blackwater Ridge, stopped shrinking whenever people looked at her with pity, stopped believing her life had less value simply because it had been harder. Walter had trusted her with something priceless, and little by little, Grace began trusting herself too. The calls from relatives started soon after. At first, they pretended to be concerned. "Grace, sweetheart, how are you holding up out there alone?" Gloria asked one evening in an overly sweet voice. Another cousin offered to help manage the property. Derek even suggested investors who might buy old junk from the collection. Grace said no to all of them. Politely at first, then firmly, because she could hear it now beneath every conversation. Greed. They didn't care about Walter's stories, or the lives attached to the artifacts below the cabin. They cared about numbers, money, ownership, and for the first time in her life, Grace refused to let people take something from her simply because they thought she was too weak to stop them. One night, headlights appeared outside the cabin long after dark. Grace froze near the window. A black SUV sat near the edge of the property for nearly 10 minutes before finally turning around and disappearing back down the mountain road. The next morning, she found footprints near the shed behind the cabin. Fresh, watching. Grace stood silently in the snow staring at them. Weeks earlier, fear would have swallowed her whole. Now it only sharpened her resolve. She immediately reinforced the locks on the cellar hatch, installed motion lights around the cabin, using money from Walter's hidden emergency cash box, backed up all inventory records digitally. Every decision became deliberate, protective, because this place no longer felt like an inheritance. It felt sacred. One evening, Harlan Pierce visited the cabin personally for the first time since Walter's death. The older man moved slowly through the underground chamber, examining shelves carefully beneath the warm lights. Finally, he turned toward Grace. "You've done remarkable work here," he said quietly. Grace looked down modestly. "I'm trying." Harlan smiled faintly. "No," he corrected gently. "You're preserving something most people would have sold without a second thought." He glanced around the room. Walter chose correctly. The words hit Grace harder than she expected. For a moment, she couldn't speak, because all her life, she had felt like someone left behind, the unwanted girl. The burden, the one people whispered about with sympathy in grocery stores and church parking lots. But standing there beneath the cabin, surrounded by stories waiting to survive another generation, Grace finally saw herself differently. not abandoned. Chosen. That night, after Harlan left, Grace sat alone beside the fire upstairs while snow drifted softly beyond the windows. Walter's journal rested open in her lap. For a long while, she simply stared into the flames. Then slowly, she picked up a pen. For the first time, she wrote her own entry beneath Walter's final notes. "Tonight I realized something important," she wrote carefully. This cabin was never meant to make someone rich. It was meant to make sure history stayed alive. Grace paused, her eyes drifting toward the hidden cellar beneath the floor. Then she added one final sentence. "And I will protect it for as long as I live." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the mountains stood silent beneath the winter sky. And deep within the old cabin everyone once laughed at, Grace Holloway was no longer surviving. She was becoming something far greater. A keeper of memory, a protector of legacy, a woman finally learning her own worth. Winter settled deeply over Blackwater Ridge. Snow covered the mountains in endless waves of white, softening the sharp edges of the world until the old cabin looked less like a forgotten building and more like something preserved in time. Nearly 6 months had passed since Walter Holloway's funeral. 6 months since Grace first stepped beneath the cabin and uncovered the secret hidden below the floorboards. And in those months, everything had changed. Not just the cabin. Grace herself. The underground chamber no longer sat in darkness. Warm lights now illuminated the stone walls and wooden shelves Walter had spent decades protecting. Every artifact had been carefully cataloged, every letter preserved, every story documented. Grace had transformed the cellar into something beautiful. Not a vault, not a treasure room, a living archive. Word slowly spread beyond Blackwater Ridge. First came historians, then collectors, then veterans and museum archivists curious about the remarkable Holloway collection hidden deep within the Colorado mountains. Most arrived expecting riches. Instead, they found stories. Stories of soldiers who never returned home. Immigrant families who carried their lives across oceans in battered suitcases. Miners, farmers, widows, and forgotten people whose memories survived only because Walter Holloway had refused to let them disappear. And standing quietly at the center of it all was Grace, the orphan girl everyone once pitied. Now, guiding visitors through history with calm confidence in her voice, she no longer lowered her eyes when people spoke to her, no longer apologized for existing. For the first time in her life, people listened when Grace Holloway spoke. One afternoon, a local reporter arrived from Denver hoping to interview her about the collection. Grace almost declined. Old habits still lingered sometimes, but eventually she agreed. The interview took place beside the fireplace while snow drifted gently outside the windows. The reporter glanced around the cabin in amazement. "So," he asked carefully, "what does it feel like knowing this collection is worth millions?" Grace smiled softly. Then she looked toward the cellar hatch hidden beneath the old stove. "It doesn't feel like money," she answered honestly. The reporter tilted his head slightly. "Then what does it feel like?" Grace was quiet for a moment. Finally, she said, "It feels like being trusted." The room fell silent after that. Because the truth was, the collection had never truly changed Grace's life. Walter had. His belief in her, his trust, his quiet understanding of who she could become long before she ever saw it herself. The money was only what caught people's attention. But the legacy beneath the cabin, that was what saved her. By early spring, Grace made a decision that surprised everyone in Blackwater Ridge. Instead of selling the collection, she partnered with historical preservation groups to officially restore the Holloway cabin as a protected historical archive. Under one condition, nothing would ever leave the mountain. Because Walter had preserved those stories here, and here they would remain. The town that once mocked the cabin slowly changed too. Tourists began visiting. Local businesses reopened. The old diner on Main Street turned its lights back on for the first time in years. Even people who once laughed at Grace now spoke about her differently. With respect. Some with regret. Raymond Holloway never apologized directly. But one morning, he appeared quietly at the cabin carrying a box of old family photographs he'd found buried in his attic. "I figured these belong here," he said awkwardly. Grace looked at him for a long moment before accepting the box gently. Neither of them spoke much after that. They didn't need to, because some wounds heal quietly, just like everything else in the Holloway family. On the first warm evening of spring, Grace stood alone on the cabin porch watching sunlight spill across the mountains beyond the trees. The air smelled of melting snow and pine. Below her, the valley glowed gold beneath the setting sun. For years, Grace had believed her life was something broken, a story shaped by loss, by abandonment, by surviving quietly while others moved forward without her. But standing there now, wrapped in Walter Holloway's old coat, she finally understood something differently. The world had not forgotten her. It had been preparing her to protect something fragile, something human, something worth saving. A soft wind moved through the trees. Behind her, the cabin lights glowed warmly through the windows, while distant laughter echoed softly from visitors still exploring the archive below. The old cabin was alive now, not because of the money hidden beneath it, but because someone had finally listened to the stories buried there. Grace closed her eyes briefly and smiled. They had mocked her tiny inheritance. They had laughed when Walter Holloway left her the old cabin no one wanted. But beneath the dust, silence, and forgotten wood, he had left her far more than $3 million. He had left her purpose, a family, a legacy, a place to belong. And for the first time since losing her parents all those years ago, Grace Holloway no longer felt alone. People laughed when Grace Holloway inherited an old cabin in the mountains. They saw a broken house, a poor orphan girl, a worthless inheritance. But beneath that cabin was a $3 million secret, and beneath Grace's quietness was something even rarer strength. Walter Holloway didn't leave her wealth because she needed money. He left her purpose, because sometimes the people who've suffered the most are the only ones gentle enough to protect what truly matters. In the end, the cabin didn't just change Grace's life, it gave her something she had never truly had before. A place to belong. Never judge someone by what they inherit or by what they seem to lack. Some people carry hidden value the world cannot see at first glance. And sometimes, the smallest door leads to the greatest legacy. If this story moved you, subscribe for more emotional stories about hidden legacies, second chances, and people who discovered their true worth when the world least expected it.